I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I could not be more tickled to be hosting tonight's program in honor of the late, great John le Carré and his novel, Silverview, which we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm not going to talk for too very long, but I do want to just encourage you, first of all, to continue doing what you're already doing, which is to chat among yourselves in the chat area in our crowdcast tonight, knowing that this program is being recorded. You can come back to it anytime you like to watch it over again. And the chat remains active and live in perpetuity. So if you make a friend here or start an interesting conversation, come on back and continue that. However, we are going to have a Q&A session toward the end of our program tonight, and we are going to have, all of our guests are going to take questions. If you have a question, rather than post it in the chat, if I could ask you please to put that in the Q&A section rather than in the chat, that would be awesome. And the Q&A section here in Crowdcast is labeled Ask a Question. It's very at the bottom of your screen in the middle. While we're down there, I will draw your attention to that long green button that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here. Yes, we would love for you to donate whatever you can, but what we'd really like would be for you to join us in a couple weeks for our annual virtual gala. And there's a link in the chat for our gala, which is happening on November 4th. And we've got a huge, great lineup of really important authors and speakers who are representing themselves as supporters of the Mark Twain House and Museum. And you can join them simply by joining the gala and taking part in the amazing virtual auction and just taking part in that. And that is, again, our major fundraiser for the year. So please do join us for that. I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors for tonight's program. We're sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and the Connecticut Public, WNPR. And this program is produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord. And also in your chat, you can see there's a link for a very, very generous offer from Harper's Magazine, our co-sponsor of this series. They've offered a very lovely subscription discount, $16.97 for a year's subscription to Harper's. And that includes access to their archives, which are fascinating. And I have to say, includes some contributions by our own Mark Twain. So please take advantage of that offer if you're able. And also, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that you can purchase a copy of tonight's book, Silverview by John le Carré. Now, usually we offer signed copies. Sadly and inevitably tonight, we're not able to offer signed copies, but please do know that if you do purchase that book through that link this evening, you will be benefiting the Mark Twain House and Museum, and know that we deeply appreciate that support. So I want to introduce our guests. Walter Mosely is the best-selling novelist who joined us earlier this year for a program that actually didn't work out very well, and we're so grateful that he gave us another chance. Thank you for being here, Walter Mosely, author of the Easy Rawlins Mysteries and winner of the National Book Foundation Lifetime Achievement Award. Scott Detrow is the NPR White House Correspondent and co-host of NPR's Politics podcast. And we're so honored to be joined by LeCarré's son, John Cornwell, who writes novels under the pen name Nick Harkaway. And tonight's program will be moderated by our dear friend, Christopher Beha, editor of Harper's Magazine, who's been helping us with these programs for many months now. Welcome all of you. We're so glad to see you all, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be Zooming with you.
It's what we do.
So I guess I'm going to jump in here. As Jennifer said, I'm Chris Beha. I'm the editor of Harper's Magazine. I am also a huge fan of John le Carré's work. If I were getting Wi-Fi in my library right now, what I would be doing is showing off my shelf, which I attempted to do to my other panelists and promptly got locked out of the Zoom. So I'm not going to do that now, but you're just going to have to trust me that there's about 3 feet worth of John le Carré up on my shelf. And it was a real thrill to get to work on doing an excerpt of this book, Silverview. As an editor, when you're excerpting novels, you don't do a ton of work. It's already been edited, of course, and you're just kind of doing a cut. But in particular, when you're editing a posthumous novel, your options are limited. So I can't say I did a ton, but what I can say is that I got to work one last time, having done once before on LeCarré's work. And I would also say, Jennifer mentioned the Harper's archive. If you are a subscriber and can go into the archive, you will find that LeCarré's earliest contribution was from the mid-'60s, very soon after The Spy Who Came In From the Cold really made him a huge international phenomenon. So he was not a frequent contributor, but he had a long-standing relationship with the magazine. So we were very happy to be able to publish this last book. What I'd like to do first is just I want to mention that yesterday would have been John le Carré's 90th birthday, and there was a memorial service for him. He, as you all know, passed away back in December. But I would like to hand it over to Nick first to just speak a little bit about this manuscript and its history and your own work on it, and basically how it came to be, a little under a year after your father's death, that this novel is coming out into the world.
Hi, absolutely. So we always knew there was a book. I think my older brother Simon had even read it. My dad had written it in 2014, put it aside, taken it out occasionally, tinkered with it, put it back away. And it was unclear why. Everybody who'd seen it thought it was great. I hadn't seen it. So then, in terms of sort of, as it were, the rediscovery of the manuscript. So in December last year, on about the 8th, I got a phone call saying, your dad's gone into hospital. It's fine. He'll be out in a few days. Everything's okay. There's no need to panic. And I decided that probably there was. Just my mother wasn't very well, and she was by herself in a remote house. I mean, they had a team down there to help them out, but even so, she'd be by herself in the nighttime and so on. So I went down by car. It was kind of mid-pandemic, but I was allowed to travel, so I went down, and very quickly it became apparent that I wasn't kind of making a visit. I was kind of part coordinating a crisis, and on the 12th, then he died in hospital. And so I was then for 2.5 months, I was locked down looking after my mother with my family. And sometime in the middle of that really kind of strange, bleak, beautiful, awful COVID winter, I sort of sat up in bed one morning and remembered the existence of this book. And I'd made a rash promise a few years before. It's kind of walking on Hampstead Heath with my father, where in the way that we were having a conversation, he had kind of, over the course of the last decade, he had encounters with the idea of his own mortality from time to time, and he became introspective and thoughtful, and and he was squaring things away. So during one of those periods, he'd said to me as we were walking together, if I leave something unfinished, will you take care of it? Will you finish it? Will you sort it out? And I, my God, I mean, obviously appallingly flattered, as the kind of second generation novelist, and as the son, and if you can't possibly say no to that, but at the same time, we're talking about my father's death, and I'm kind of saying, essentially, I don't really want to think about this. So yes, of course I will do that. So I promised I would do it without really thinking what that could mean. And then in early February, I kind of sat bolt upright in bed and realized there was this book, and I had undertaken this, this promise. And the first kind of worry that I had was, maybe he was right. Maybe he put it away for a good reason. And so I went to my mother's office, and I got this bundle of typescript tied up with string out of the cupboard. And I sat down, I read it in bed in the first part, and then I went into his office because the house was too noisy, and I read it there. and it was great. It was just a terrifically good kind of small, perfect story. And, so I called my brothers and I said, this is a thing. And, it went from there. We knew we had a book, and the story was complete. No manuscript that hasn't been through the publishing mill is ready to go. So, it needed work, but very little. And so, I obviously had a very light touch rule. The weird thing is, as a son particularly, but also as another writer, you have to be very disciplined with yourself, and you have to try very hard to be egoless. But I mean, I had to lose every argument I've ever had with my father again. Every time I'd be like, kind of, I don't think you're right about that. I think that's different. The world doesn't work that way. People don't talk that way, or they do talk this way, or whatever. And I had to just take my fingers out of the pudding basin and stop adding my own stuff, and just so the book that you have, although it's not necessarily the book that he would have produced had he done the final edit, because he was very radical in final edits. Very often he's tearing things up in galley proof, publishers weeping on the telephone, so so the book that you have is 100% him, or as near as damn it. And that was the idea that we went with.
I have to say, as an editor, that's obviously what you're trying to do. When you hope improving a text, you're improving it to make it the best version of the thing the writer wanted to do, rather than trying to make it what you would have done if you had been the writer. But it must be a particular, I don't know if you had done editing in the past, or you were just coming at it as a novelist or something.
I mean, I've only edited my own books in the past. I've only ever done it from the point of view of being the writer of origin. And I mean, and I have to say, in that sense, I mean, I was working with Mary Mount at Penguin here in the UK. So Mary was fulfilling her normal role, and I was working as my dad. So it was a strange, very kind of beautiful thing to be doing. And you have this, obviously you have this romantic illusion that you'll kind of look up from the desk and see him sitting in the leather armchair by the door, kind of nodding at you, and then he'll kind of fade away into the afternoon sun. And of course that doesn't happen. Yeah. But what did happen was that we very seldom talk directly about the craft of writing. But one of the things that he always told me was that pros show up and do the work, and they do it hungover, sick, sad, mournful, joyful, drunk, whatever. You have to show up. And so sitting there in this bleak midwinter doing the work, I kind of felt that I had discharged that kind of that truth about writing as well. And that did make me feel a little tiny bit of kind of shared experience.
I want to bring Walter in here. This may be a slightly morbid way to start, so excuse me, but it occurs to me as I'm listening, there aren't a lot of people out there with a big enough audience like Le Carré had, that you even worry about an unfinished manuscript, where people are going to want to read anything. They want to read grocery lists, but I think you're one of them. And I wonder if that is something that you ever think about when you're halfway through a manuscript or something. Is this, or if there are manuscripts that you've abandoned along the way that you wonder, well, is this going to wind up out in the world after I'm gone, or something like that?
I never have thought of it before, but now you've put it in my head. Who knows? Maybe I'll start thinking about it now. I haven't thought about that. I have to say, reading Silverview, it kind of felt like somebody thinking about that. I mean, among many other things about the novel, which I think it's a beautiful book. It kind of brings you back to his first books. It's really short, and it has a place where it's going. And there's a man who is almost, there's a character who's almost not there, and then is not there. It's rather than kind of what Nick was saying, rather than having somebody sitting in a chair and appearing and then disappearing. You have that character in the novel, and that interests me a lot more than, who's going to read me after I'm dead. It's that there did seem to be a moment that this book was saying, well, this might be the last time, and it might be the last time for this character. And then, of course, you just, think about the writer whenever they ever do anything like that. So, but it's a beautiful novel.
Yeah. He has he had a wonderful ability to have these books that are thinking through, things like different stages of life, the fact of endings, thinking through legacies, or, if it's the breakups of marriages or things like that. We're doing that at the same time that they were telling, sort of quote unquote, a spy story. These things weren't in tension with each other. They were the things that were happening at the same time. And I wonder if that's something that you think a lot about in your work, is the way that you're writing in a particular case, a detective novel. You have certain things that you want it to do in order to be that kind of novel. And then you have other things that you want to be talking about or writing about, thinking about where you are in your life or what's going, things like that.
Well, I mean, I mean, really, it feels like I'm coming from a completely different way to try to answer that question. But the thing that I find really exciting about all of his work is how the pedestrian connects, with the grand, with the grandiose, which the world, the history of the world, what's happening, why are these things happening? But then you have these people who are, maybe falling in love, maybe falling out of love, maybe drinking a little bit too much, people dying, people, passing on, in the world. And that's what really draws me in and makes me think about the work, is that it's so important for your audience, no matter where they are, no matter where in the world, to be able to identify bodily and emotionally with what's going on with these characters, which is why, listen, I like reading James Bond. I don't mind, but I never feel that reading those books, because it's always going to be on that high pitch. And this is like, boy, I could be here. I could be in this room. I could smell that odor. I could be talking to that woman. It's really kind of extraordinary to be able to, I mean, those are your best writers, right? Always,
Yeah, absolutely. Scott, I want to just bring you in here, and we were saying before we started that we're actually occupying similar places as just big fans of the work, and I wonder, as someone who is a longtime reader and fan, what your response to this novel was and how it fit into your readings of his other works.
Yeah, I will confess, and curious how Nick feels about this. As an outsider, as a reader, the last two books that were announced, Agent Running the Field a couple of years ago, and then Silverview, I had kind of a strange mixed response when you see that article. The new book's coming, because, like, for me, I thought A Legacy of Spies, maybe was that 5 years ago now or so. I thought that was just like the most beautiful way to kind of go back to the classic early works and bring it up to the modern spycraft, which is so much more clinical and not the thing that you would have as much of a human book in. And I thought, like, this is perfect. This is all tied together. There was that scene there when kind of the modern era spies are making their way through, like, the Smiley era safe house and literally ripping it apart. And it was devastating. Like, I felt crushed reading it. And I just love that book so much. So I was kind of like, oh, I don't know. But then I've actually really enjoyed the last two books. And Silverview, I thought, really kind of had a similar feel to the last one, where I think, like what you were saying, they were kind of like a more classic, faster paced, shorter book. They're kind of multi-generations kind of working through different human feelings from multiple ways at the same time. They're kind of getting into into the actual plot. I felt like there were kind of lost souls who kind of accidentally wander into the scene and find themselves making like human choices. I thought it was interesting. I'm trying to think how to say this without giving away too many plot points. That I feel like earlier on and in sort of the the 70s era books especially, like there's very cold endings that just very clinical. This is real life. This is how it is. It's not always neatly wrapped up. And I feel like people get away with things in the last couple of books in an interesting way. And I like that. I liked the way that I felt getting to the end of the last few books. And I really enjoyed this read.
Well, Lawndsley, this character, and we'll say a little bit about the book, has come from this, I think, finance job in the city in London, but has obviously made himself at a relatively young age fairly wealthy, and he goes and buys this like small bookshop. Despite it seems like not actually knowing that much about books or having like a great passion for literature, it's in a kind of like he likes the idea of like owning a small bookshop in a sort of like seaside town, and then gets himself embroiled in some things as they go. But he is not a character who's treated cynically at all. And I think it's again, without like spoiling too much, he's not a character whose motives we come to question, whereas there is maybe a particular kind of writer or a particular era of LeCarré himself where a figure like that, who's kind of like made whatever ethical sacrifices one has to make to get very rich very young, and is now kind of living it out in this way, would have been handled with maybe a little less generosity or something like that. Nick, do you feel what I'm saying?
I do. I think, I have to say, I was really delighted when Walter was saying he thought that the this book kind of harks back to the first ones and has that kind of, it feels to me that this and Delicate Truth, which, and as far as I can work it out, this would have been written immediately after Delicate Truth, have a kind of distillation process going on where they look back and they see the work that's gone before, they take it on board, they reflect on it, and they do the same thing only with more layers, and yet somehow you can't find the layers, you just experience the book. I think they're really interesting. And so I think you're right. Julian Lawndsley in many ways, my dad was a guy he spent his life looking for home. He came from a pretty terrible, it's funny, like we tell funny stories about my grandfather, Ronnie Cornwell, who was a confidence trickster and a professional crook and so on. And the thing is that actually when you listened to my uncle, my aunt, and my dad when he was unguarded, actually in the gaps between the fairy lights, the darkness was pretty deep. That was a bad household to come from. And my grandmother, Olive, ran away when my dad was 5. The kids were told she was dead. And my dad essentially ran from Britain in 1947, took himself to Bern University and described himself to the University of Bern as a refugee from England, studied German in 1947. That's great, by the way. Here is this kid sitting in the back of a public lecture in the University of Bern, and the lecturer is going on about die fliegende Blätter von Art und Kunst, the floating leaves of art and artifice. And Dad has like schoolboy German. He understands barely a word of this. And at the end of the lecturer comes up and says, "Who are you? What are you doing in my lecture hall?" And he delivers this great line, because he's nothing if not the son of a confidence trickster. He says, "I'm a refugee from England." And the guy says, "Well, in that case, you better stay." And that was just how they did, apparently. They was like, "Yeah, fine, we'll take him on, we'll find him a study course." So, so then he does that for a while. Then he ends up in the world of spies. And then he rejects that world in favor of essentially, the writing world, but essentially in search again for some kind of truth, some kind of authenticity, which he can't find until then. And then he's an angry critic of the terrible things the British government does and anybody else does, really because he never met an underdog he didn't want to represent. And because his first instinct, politics is one thing, but his first instinct was always compassion. And so he's that guy. And then very late in life, which is wonderful, he discovers Ireland. He has this extraordinary thing where the Irish government grants him citizenship on the basis of his Irish grandmother and so on. And he then finally came home. And I saw him just after he'd received the news, and we had a big celebration. It was his birthday last year. And I've never seen him so joyful. All of which is to say that Julian Lawndsley, falling out of the City of London and the financial industry, appointing himself a bookseller with no idea what books are, is typical of my dad in a way. When he wrote Taylor of Panama, he just believed we should all move to Panama. For 6 weeks, he was window shopping houses in Panama, and we were all going to go and live there. And that happened constantly. He was a man who was looking for a context, despite the fact that he had one. He had lots. And so I think the sympathy for Julian Lawndsley is inevitable. It's like, okay, here, have a guy who is just looking to find a place to be someone he can live with. And then into that quest for almost simplicity falls all the crazy geopolitical nonsense of the world.
Yeah,
it's a kind of, and that, from a writing point of view, obviously that's a classic. You've got, somebody who doesn't want all this stuff, and it just lands on them, and they have to do something about it. And they're just dragged out of their cave into the world. And then again, it's futile looking for authors in their own writing, because you find them everywhere and nowhere. But again, you have the character of Edward, who's this kind of furious, widely traveled idealist. And again, I see my dad's footsteps in that.
But when you think about it, at least when I think about it, Florian or Edward, really, it could, when you're reading about your father, Florian really could be his father, because he's incredibly really, he could just trick the pants right off you. But he never really does anything terrible to you. He's just, he's going to be the person who shows you what the world is really like, and use you as much as he can. But in the end, not only do you still love him, you're protecting him. It's so extraordinary, the relationship, between this guy who's kind of disappearing all over the place and this young guy who has done some really morally questionable things in London. And he's now, wanting to kind of make up for that, but he hasn't the slightest idea how to do it. I just, it's almost impossible not to think about how much this is reflecting what was your father's own experience, completely through everything, including, the whole spy world.
Yeah.
And then at the same.
Sorry, go ahead.
One other thing I was thinking of, we was talking about this, the other main character, Proctor, who kind of starts out with a bit of a sympathetic view, I think. But then I was thinking he's not quite condemned, but I don't think there's a single scene where he's not lying to the person he's talking to. I don't think he tells the full truth once in the entire book.
That's his job.
I want to know now. That's really interesting. So obviously that had not occurred to me. And that's one of those things, someone thinks like, damn, should I have realized that when I was working on this book? That's amazing. I wonder if that's true.
But one thing that has occurred to me in the past, when you were sort of telling the story of your father's youth up into becoming you almost in passing said, then he went through this period of getting into the world of spying, which obviously then did set the course for the rest of his life, and that it became a subject matter for these books. But I think one can sort of conceive of an alternate universe in which that didn't happen, and in which he had a career, maybe under the name David Cornwell, because he wouldn't have been forced to write under a pseudonym, where he didn't write about spies, but he would, no matter what, in the essentials, if he was going to be the novelist he was writing about people who lied to each other and about this.
He froze.
He did.
He's
Now
gonna
what?
come back, though. All right.
Oh my.
Yeah. It seemed to be kind of that world of artifices and lies and layers of people, but like, could that exist? It seemed like he was, I guess I'm doing what you're doing here with the book, but with this frozen Zoom question, do you think kind of those themes could have existed against a different backdrop of a different profession?
I'm sure they could have done. And I think, I mean, inevitably, Ronnie's criminal life, was the basis for the obsession with deception. And I think, I mean, it's not true that Ronnie never hurt anybody. He really did. He was extraordinary, though, because people would come back to be hurt again because he was so much fun and because they liked him. And in a way, that's the most monstrous thing about the guy, but I mean, he was the guy who would he'd take you for 100 quid and then you'd meet him in a bar and he'd say, oh my God, did you never get the 200 that I sent you to make up for that? That's awful. Listen, I tell you what, I'm working on something now, and if you've got £10, and he'd take your last 10 quid, and then he'd leave you. But we met. We were on holiday when I was very little, and we heard this voice. Voices are fascinating in this. We should come back to this. My dad's voice. I've been listening to recordings of him over the years, and the thing is that I know that half the people who raised him had, kind of London criminal voices. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and then we've sort of, and yet when you hear him talking, he's got this Etonian clipped voice when he's in like 1970 or so. And that can't have been anything other than a voice that he made up, that he found for himself. And then later, as he gets older again, you've got this very, very beautiful, much more relaxed, gravelier delivery, which is his own voice coming through again. So I'm fascinated by the voices thing. But so here's this voice. The first time that I heard somebody from Ronnie's court kind of talking, and you're listening and you hear this guy at the next table go, yeah, right, we need a bit more of the pineapple and 2 more cups of coffee. And my dad's face, as he hears this voice, goes absolutely pale, and he stands up and kind of walking like a ghost, he goes over to this table, puts his hand out and touches the guy on the shoulder and says, excuse me, but aren't you Reg? And Reg, in Reg's life, when someone puts his hand on your shoulder and asks you your name, you're about to get arrested. So he turns around and he says, what if I am? And then he sees my dad and recognizes, the kid in between times that he half raised because Ronnie could never be bothered. And Reg delivered this line on Ronnie. He said, we was all bent, David, but your dad, he was very, very bent. And Reg had done time for Ronnie. And Ronnie had told him he'd sort it out, and he never did. And he said, I knew he wasn't going to. I knew he wasn't going to, David, but I love that man, so I did it anyway. I mean, it was, and it's even telling that story, we're all kind of grinning because Ronnie was a rogue. But the thing is, he left a trail of devastation.
What percentage, since you're mentioning him, what percentage, I mean, most people would probably know him through the perfect spy character based on him. What percentage of that character would you say was your grandfather?
I think that was a really generous portrayal of my grandfather. And I think it was pretty direct. When Rick McCallum, who played him in the TV show, came to the house, they were talking for a while, Rick and my dad, and then Rick went out of the room. So I just want to show you something. And he came in, Ronnie, and he put his arm out around David, and he got him and I could see my dad seize up, kind of like, oh, shit. And Dad said afterwards, it was completely terrifying. He had just from Rick Pym, he had deduced Ronnie Cornwell. And it was extraordinary. I mean, I think it was really very affecting. So I think that character is very much Ronnie, but I think Ronnie sanitized. Dad was generous to Ronnie unconsciously throughout his life.
He sounds like a guy. If you're a good con man, people want to be. I mean, people want it. You steal 100 pounds. So, well, it was actually worth it to me to have that money taken from me. Because I mean, I'm not trying to make him a good guy or anything. I'm just saying. But I want to ask a question that one of the things that I recognized more reading this book than I ever have before, but it's not that it wasn't there before, was the extraordinary strength of the women characters. I mean, they were unbelievably, and not strong, like sometimes you can sit in the world and say, well, that a woman can't be as strong as a man because she can't lift 300 pounds. And you're going, yeah, you're kind of missing it, there. But these women, there was a great deal of strength about having to do with survival, not having to do with what you think about them. I mean, you have a main character who nobody knows who she is until after she's dead and they put her on the ground. But, and that didn't matter. But that is such an extraordinary, and where does that come from in the work, do you think?
So, I mean, it's really interesting. There's always been a discourse around his female characters and, when did he get it right? When did he not? I think with this book particularly, he was really reaching for that. He wanted it. And it came through for me very strongly reading the typescript that, with a lot of things, he was reaching for kind of making things work that people had criticized him over. And he wanted it to be right. And so the book has a more modern feel to me in some ways. I believe devoutly, but I am completely biased, that part of that is the arrival of my wife, Claire, in the sort of family world, because you can see the footsteps of Claire and the people that she has been in her career through some of the women in my father's writing. So you get traces of her and Tessa in Constant Gardener, which is around when we first met. Then you see her again in Most Wanted Man. Claire was working for Reprieve, getting people out of Guantanamo at the time, and Reprieve has a big death penalty project in the US as well and around the world, so on. So that you get a kind of sequence of formidable, idealistic lawyers in my father's books who arrive coincident with Claire's arrival. And I think there's a fairly straightforward, there's an additional template that he felt able to play with, that he knew better, and and who he heard speaking, and I think that was a big part of it. Obviously, I would think that because I am horrifically biased, but that's what I choose to believe.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask one other quick question about a female character in this book? And again, I'm trying to filter through a plot twist, screen. There is one key character who comes up in Teddy's past, and you realize that is a motivating character who is very, the reader ends up learning very little to nothing about her, right? She's a very mysterious character. And of course, there are so many LeCarré characters like that you have to figure it out and think about it and go back and reread 3 different times and say, was there a clue there? Was there not a clue? Is that just all open-ended? But with an unfinished manuscript, did you have any thought of, did he intend to come back and write more about what this character wanted, what this character was trying to do, more about that past? Or was this just, that's all you're going to get?
I think this was, the manuscript is not unfinished. It was uncompleted, but the narrative was finished. It was very clearly done. And it has that ringing last line. I didn't feel that there was any likelihood of the story continuing past that point. With so many things, I could have sat down and said, it would be nice to have more of this character, but that's not the gig.
Yeah. No, she was perfect. And I think the thing I like the most about her is she's like the ideal woman, but not for you, for the character who is like an untrustworthy character. Like, so it's like, it's his dream, right? And his life that started before he ever met her. I was so excited about that as a model. It worked It worked, and we worked really beautifully, actually. Yeah. Hi, Chris.
Welcome
Hi,
back.
I'm glad to be back.
Yes.
I appreciate everyone muddling along without me. And I'm glad Scott and I had talked about sort of being co-hosts before we started. So I'm glad that I had someone with real professional training to step in.
I professionally ask questions of things I know nothing about, and I've not written a book. So here we are.
I had
That's
a
it.
genuine moment of terror. I was like, oh my God, we're adrift now. We're running.
So, but Scott, we were going to speak briefly about your work in politics and what you think about like how Le Carré did with that. I mean, that is one of the things that they're obviously reading his books. You get an incredible history of, post-war Anglo-American or North Atlantic politics and global politics from these works.
It feels like the politicians are never really well respected in these books by the main characters. We were saying beforehand that there's this inevitable moment in a lot of the plots where the career spies realize, oh God, we have to go to Whitehall now. They're going to want us to fire somebody because that's what they do. Who's going to be fired? And like, how do we deal with this? And there's always that plot point that I really enjoy. I think especially a lot of people have written and talked about this, but the arc of the way that American officials are treated over the course of the books, and the very rightly harsh view of the war on terror, especially in the last couple of decades of the writing, I think is really interesting. And I thought this book kind of glances on that just a little bit, and kind of get those classic conversations at the end. But I think one thing that these books get at so well is that the decision makers, the office holders, often just have no idea what is going on in the departments they oversee. They don't understand the depth of it. They don't understand the context of it. They don't understand what career officials are trying to do. And any sort of solution that they come up with in these books is usually kind of like a sledgehammer over the, glossing over, oversimplified approach that's really designed to save as many asses as possible, or really hang one person out to dry so everybody can move on. Like it seems like at no point ever, unless I'm forgetting one, is somebody in Whitehall or the undersecretary for whatever stepping back and thinking thoughtfully about the best way that changes could be made.
And this ignorance is often like a willful ignorance.
Yeah.
Because it's getting them, plausible deniability, or
right.
that there's the rank and file make the hard moral choices, and then this sort of like superstructure gets to sort of like dole out the consequences for those sort of choices or something.
They make those choices, and they better not mess it up.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we're at the point where we might invite Jennifer to come back in and see if we have some audience questions.
Okay.
Wow. Well, I'm not sure I want to go to audience questions because let me listen to you all talk for a little bit longer. What a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for all of your insights. And I have to say, I have a master's degree in English, and I used to work at a bookstore, and spy thrillers didn't strike me as being particularly literary when I was growing up and moving through that process. Can you talk a little bit about that? A kind of prejudice, and obviously I was so wrong. And after we talk about that, Chris, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the process of editing this book, Silverview, into an excerpt that you published in Harper's. So jump in, please.
I mean, I'm happy to attempt to answer some of the first question and just say that I think that, if you read a lot of the great 19th century into early 20th century novelists, and you read, someone like Conrad, for example, that these are not long-standing, in terms of the history of literature, distinctions or hierarchies. These are commercial distinctions that got made over the course of the 20th century, and then managed to get, to a large degree, broken back down, having been, been made, I don't know, maybe by in the era of the modernists, or but so I that's my view on this stuff. I don't know, Walter, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I do think that late 18th or early 19th century spy novels were extraordinary. I mean, there's like, it was serious work, even James Fenimore Cooper is like doing that. I also think that the popularity of spy novels starting in the middle of the 20th century goes more to people like Ian Fleming, and so it starts to become an adventure. It's more like Robin Hood, and so and also listen, Le Carré is an extraordinary writer in any field for any reason. His prose is just gorgeous. I mean, to start to say, well, I have to think differently about these novels because I read this guy. Well, this guy is like one of the best writers writing, and so it's going to be great. That's I mean, that's how I've felt about it, and I think it's true. I mean, there's a lot of books. I was just looking. I mean, there's a whole bunch of modern spy novels. I don't know most of them, and maybe there are people who are like really extraordinary. I don't know really, so I can't say. But I do know.
Sorry, I think it's worth saying that like what you're not going to actually find in Le Carré is like people running down streets with their guns pulled out, chasing after people and rolling over cars. And what the flip side of it is that he isn't doing some of the things that sort of genre spy novels do. That isn't the thing about espionage that is interesting to him.
Well, it's not interesting. It's not espionage, like
and right. And the thing, right? His version of it, I think, does seem to be, it is what it's probably much closer to what it's actually like. But they're not. They're heavily plotted books, but they're not fast-paced plots. They're slowly unfolding, and they do a lot of things that I think people who just want to read kind of quote unquote genre like spy novels are actually going to be pretty impatient with,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Also the thing is, if he had got another job, maybe if his father was like a bricklayer instead of a con man, then maybe he would have been writing about the unions, about labor. And I could see this writing being just as interesting,
right.
Talking about labor and strikes and what the politicians are doing and what the capitalists are doing. I mean, it's he write when you read the book, when you read this book or any of them, it talks about everything. There's no part of everyday life that's left untouched in a Le Carré novel, because these are people who live in the world, and they're people of the world, and that's what makes it so wonderful.
Scott and Nick, would you like to add to that in any way?
I mean, I think it's pretty well answered. I mean, I guess the only thing that occurs to me is that inevitably with genres, as soon as someone comes along who writes beautifully in a genre, they then get extracted from it and put on a different shelf. So I think any genre,
people try to copy them for the next 10 years.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
Right.
Or other authors try to copy that exact style for the next 10 years.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm just going to jump in and then I'll go to the couple of audience questions. My last name is Leroux. I have no French heritage. Le Carré is a French sounding name. Where is there a French heritage there?
Gloriously, it's made up. The story is, I mean, writers lie about this kind of thing all the time, but he told so many versions of this story, but I'll give you the best one.
Okay.
When the first books came out, he had to choose a pseudonym because he was still working as a spy. And his UK publisher, Victor Galanx, I think, said, David, you're going to choose a simple monosyllabic Anglo-Saxon pseudonym. People eat that up. And he was so irritated by this advice that he chose a polysyllabic French name. And then he misspelled it, which drives the French publishers absolutely nuts.
Right.
Because it's a small L, which is completely not what would happen in France. So literally, when I was working briefly, I did a work experience thing for a month at his French publisher, and they had a thing over the till, not the till, the desk, and it kind of literally with the small L and the large L and the large L crossed out to remind everybody when you're corresponding not to. So it's a wonderful, and who knows, he claimed to have seen it written on the side of a bus and just decided it was a great name.
Well, it worked, huh?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Wow. So one of our listeners tonight, Wilfred, wants to know, Nick, when you came across this, what was the form of the manuscript? Did you have a typewritten manuscript to look at, or what did you have?
So I had a typewritten manuscript. He handwrote everything. And initially my mother, and then later when she wasn't so well, the PA down in Cornwall typed everything up. And then there would, between my parents, there would be this extraordinary flow of ideation and discussion where, like, some of my earliest memories are kind of sitting in my parents' bedroom, drinking tea in the morning before I went to school. And my dad would have the pages with, I mean, we're back in the days of real cut and paste, except it was cut and staple. So the A4 pages sliced across the middle and stapled back together with handwriting all over the
Remember that?
And he would be reading and he would be changing it. My mother would be nodding or significantly not nodding, and there would be a dialogue between them, and then he would go to his desk and the whole thing would be completely changed or revitalized or whatever. I mean, there was a real interplay between them. So yeah, so this book was, as I say, tied up with string in the cupboard in my mother's office, waiting.
Wow. Wow, wow. So that leads into the next question from Stephen Geishier about posthumous publishing.
Yeah.
And I'd like everybody to weigh in on this, if you would, on the, so as an author and as an editor and a publishing kind of sense of things. Can we talk about that?
I mean, I think for what it's worth, that this is a very particular circumstance when the author has charged his son with getting this manuscript to the finish line. That's not, and we also, I think we would agree, this is he was writing at full powers. This is not going to be every Le Carré reader's favorite book, but it's not going to lower him in anyone's estimation, or there's no one who's going to look at this and say this needed to stay in the drawer. It's a good book, and and as Nick said, it was completed. It's not a fragment. It's a, I don't know how much work he did on it, but it's a completed book. And so in this, what?
No one will ever know.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I like it.
Yeah, so I don't think if the question is about some of the ethical things that come up with posthumous publication, I don't think any of them apply in this case. But I do think that in many cases it is there are very interesting questions. Nabokov explicitly told his son not to publish the fragments of this last thing that eventually did get published as the original of Laura, and it's not very good. It didn't need to get published. It doesn't really tell you, even if you're a huge Nabokov fan, that much about his work. It's certainly not a novel that you would sit down and read for pleasure. It's only for completists and people curious about him. And in addition, the way that it deals with some of the themes that are dealt with in some of his writing, it potentially, I think, has made some people think slightly less of him. And so that's a much more charged thing than something like this. But maybe, I don't know, Nick, you were the one sort of faced with the.
We were alive to all the dangers, right? I mean, and we would not have put the book out if it wasn't good, and we would never have put it out if we thought he didn't want it out there. I've been speculating about why he put it in a drawer. The first thing that I've suggested is that the rudderless Secret Intelligence Service in Silverview was simply too much for him. He cared about his old service. And the more he polished the book, the more it would have been apparent that in this book, there is no George Smiley. There is nobody to reignite the flame. And that is an indictment of something, whether it's British society or the service itself. But the service is carrying the can, and that would have made him very uncomfortable. He treasured his relationship with the service. The second thing is, even in a sense more obvious, the image of death in this book, the dying of the old woman there, whether he was contemplating his own death, and there is a centrality to that in the story, and it simply upset him, or whether in doing so he accidentally wrote the image that must haunt him, the possibility of my mother dying. Because, I mean, when I was reading Silverview for the first time, one of the most extraordinary things about it was how accurately he portrayed this happening and how true it was to my mother's death. And that, she hadn't been diagnosed, but when this was written, there can have been no foresight. But I mean, for me, if I had written that and, begun to see the future of in that way, I would have found that very difficult. Maybe, the combination of those two, he just didn't, he just couldn't go anywhere near it. I don't know. And there is no way of knowing. He spoke about the book specifically and books in general with all of us, with all the sons at various different times. And we were easy in our minds about this. We had no doubt. And not least because the book is good, which just, does change the betting. Everybody wants more material from him. There'll be a book of letters next year. His correspondence is extraordinary and deep and wide and beautiful. But nobody's getting anything out of the archive that isn't good and appropriate. And, that's not what we're into.
It's interesting, the more dystopian that we get with other forms of posthumous work, with CGI posthumous acting and CGI narration and so many other things. I feel like the idea of a completed manuscript being published seems more and more like, oh, what's the problem with? I mean, obviously there are still clear problems, but like the parameters keep shifting in a much more ethically dangerous way than the manuscript over the last few years.
So Walter, you are an active author, as are others on the screen, but I'm just going to direct this at you. How do you feel about being published posthumously? And do you have things that are sitting there waiting for somebody to publish them when sadly one day you are not with us any longer?
I probably do. And I mean, I'm not really thinking of it right now, but I've started many things and, that haven't finished them. And the only thing I don't like is when people like sell your name. And so somebody else is writing as you, I really dislike that. Though I understand there's some writers they're not making any money and they have to live and they want to keep writing. And so they do it, but it's not, I'm going to be Arthur Conan Doyle. I'm going to be, I know you're going, come on. I mean, I don't like that. I don't mind people seeing, my flaws. I don't mind, because I mean, that's kind of interesting. I mean, the whole thing about writing, this is the thing. If somebody wants to be a writer and they say, well, I keep trying to write, but then I look at Tolstoy and it's so gorgeous. I said, well, you know how many drafts he did of War and Peace? I mean, like in the beginning, that could have been some like ugly shit. I mean, really,
Right.
And so, I'm interested in that, and I don't have anything against it. That is a kind of a sophisticated way of looking at it, because a lot of people, they'll if they idolize a writer, that's what it, they say, well, this is, less. But I don't mind, myself. I mean, listen, I think I had to write. If I said don't do it, then it shouldn't be done. But I'm not sure I would say don't do it, actually.
It's really interesting to think about. And I'm kind of in my head thinking about Mark Twain and how he would have felt about all of this. And I honestly don't know. So while I think further about that, Chris, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the process of excerpting from this book to this article in the magazine.
I mean, honestly, there isn't a ton to say. It was very straightforward. There are alternating storylines for the first early sets of chapters. And so I took two non-consecutive chapters because, you know, you don't want to give an excerpt that just starts two storylines. But that was it. I think it's chapters 1 and 3 of the novel, and chapter 3 starts just where chapter 1 ends. So I didn't do any real stitching, you know. I might have, I will say that there was a the book starts in one scene and then quickly goes into a sort of retrospective scene and then jumps back into where we started. And I believe that was done within the context of the novel so that chapter 1 and chapter 2, the setting off of the two storylines, can sort of happen contemporaneous to each other. So it has a justification that didn't apply to the version I was doing that didn't have any of the second storyline in it. So I tried an edit where I moved that sort of flashback around and I just did it linearly. And Nick and other powers that be said quite sensibly, if he were around to approve this, of course, that would be one thing, but we're not going to do a major substantive moving around of that sort when he's not. And I totally respected that. And, you know, that's the way it is. So, and you know what, I could have done it and he could have said no. And I obviously would have listened to him. So it was a, maybe there would have been a conversation about it or maybe not. But, you know, that was the only thing that was sort of different under these circumstances is that conversation didn't happen, whereas editorially it usually would. But beyond that, really it was just reading the manuscript, getting excited about it, and then thinking through what would be the best thing to pull out of it that would be an enjoyable standalone for our readers and make people want to go out and read the rest of the book.
When did you bring in the artist? Because the art was amazing.
Oh yeah, the art is really great, and I would have to bring our art director Katie Humphreys, who does a wonderful job, into this conversation. But you know, we got very excited that we had this excerpt. We're all, you know, big fans, and it's an event given that, you know, we do expect this is going to be the last novel of his that anyone has coming out. So as soon as we had a manuscript, you know, it gets passed along to the art director, and then she went about that work. But it is great artwork for sure.
Amazing.
And she read the whole manuscript, and our cover a designer also read the full manuscript. So you know, it doesn't just capture, the art doesn't just capture the mood of the bit that we excerpted. I feel like it captures the mood of the whole book, which is really nice.
So I don't want to keep everybody too long, and I know that we're approaching the hour and just about done, but I just want to do a quick round robin and ask everybody what's next for each of you. What are you working on, and what can we expect to see from you, and how might we get each of you to the Mark Twain House and Museum in person one of these days soon? So can we just do a quick 30 seconds and 1 minute from each of you?
Sure,
Walter.
pick somebody.
Walter first.
I guess I'm just finishing working on this television show, Snowfall, right now. So I'll be finished with that in a week or two. And then I have to write this novel about a detective character, Joe King Oliver. And the title is going to be Every Man a King.
All right. So you're going to come on your book tour, and you're going to come to Hartford and visit
On my book tour,
House.
sure.
All
Yeah.
right. All right. We're counting on it. Scott.
News-wise, I'm about to get on a plane and go to another country, which is wild in this era. I'm going to be covering President Biden's trip to Italy and Scotland, where everyone's going to save climate change or not in the next week. Just in terms of things, I'll actually briefly talk about something I just wrapped up, which was kind of the biggest reporting project I ever did. It was a podcast called Sacred Ground, which took a 20-year look at 9/11, specifically Flight 93, the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. I did it with a good friend who actually, he's a journalist, but he was the owner of the land the plane crashed on. And that just kind of opened up this. literally fell out of the sky, and that resulted in this 20-year relationship that he had with the family members of people on the plane, with the people trying to deal with what happened. And we, using all of his material, we put together a podcast and just had conversations about what a 20-year process of that is like. So you can find it at the Up First podcast feed or the NPR Politics podcast feed. It was called Sacred Ground, and that was
Sacred Ground.
Oh my gosh, thank you for that. Thank you. How about you, Nick?
I've got to write the second book in a series. The first one isn't even out yet. I'm working on a TV show. I'm having a great time. Listen, I got to tell you something else as well, Walter. We were talking earlier about libraries and bookshelves and so on. And in my parents' house down in Cornwall, there were kind of concentric bookshelves, libraries in different rooms as you got closer and closer to the bedroom. And your books are in the inner ring.
Oh,
nice. Oh,
that's
great.
wonderful.
Thank you.
And Chris, I happen to know that you're just about to go on leave to do a project. What are you working on?
I'm working on a nonfiction book. It's a difficult one to talk about briefly, and I don't think that people will want to hear me talk about it at length. But I will just say that it's a nonfiction book that is, among other things, an intellectual history of atheism. But I also want to say something to Walter as well on a personal note, which is that a couple of years ago, I got my wife, who often talked about writing things and was sometimes working on projects here and there. Your book this year, you write your novel, and she wrote it. And Little Brown published it last year. She wrote a literary thriller, and so anyway, that's. I mean, I'm a fan of your work in general, but that's in our household. That's the what your name evokes for us.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm impressed.
Who is Maud Dixon?
Right.
That's her novel. I always have to find a way to plug my wife, but in this case, it's organic, I think.
Well, what a wonderful evening. Thank you all for being here and sharing so many insights and thoughts. And I always feel smarter after an evening like tonight. So please don't be strangers. Please come visit us at the Mark Twain House as soon as you can in person. We say the Mark Twain House is a writer's home and a home for writers. And all of you are now officially among our circle of writers. So I hope that we'll hear a lot more from you. And everybody, thank you so much for your good questions and for your donations. And everybody, if you have not already purchased this book through us, I don't understand why you haven't, but go ahead and click that link and make that purchase. And we'll see you all again very soon. Subscribe to Harper's. It's a really, really great offer. So, and I did it myself, so I can vouch for it. So good night, everybody, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so
All
much.
right, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.